Good morning, guys. It's Miss Gragg. Guess what? Last week of school, we're here. We're doing it. Are y'all excited? I know I am. I know it's been kind of a weird year, but I've still enjoyed being your teacher's assistant, okay? Today I'm going to read chapter 13 of Stuart Little by E.B. White. We left off where Stuart was a substitute teacher for a classroom. Do you remember that? All the mischief he started? Well, not really started, but now we're going to read chapter 13, and the title of it is called Ames Crossing. You ready? In the loveliest town of all, where the houses were white and high, and the elm trees were green and higher than the houses, where the front yards were wide and pleasant, and the backyards were bushy and worth finding out about, where the streets sloped down to the stream, and the stream flowed quietly under the bridge, where the lawns ended in orchards, and the orchards ended in fields, and the fields ended in pastures, and the pastures climbed the hills and disappeared over the top toward the wonderful wide sky. In the loveliest of all towns, Stuart stopped to get a drink of sarsaparilla. That was a very long sentence. All that I just read was one sentence. Anyway, parking his car in front of the general store, he stepped out, and the sun felt so good that he sat down on the porch for a few moments to enjoy the feeling of being in a new place on a fine day. This was the most peaceful and beautiful spot he had found in all of his travels, and it seemed to him a place that he would gladly spend the rest of his life in, if it weren't that he might get homesick for the sights of New York, and for his family, Mr. and Mrs. Frederick C. Little and George, and if it weren't for the fact that something deep inside him made him want to find Morgallo. Okay. So here he is, sitting on the front porch of such a nice little town. After a while, the storekeeper came out to smoke a cigarette, and he joined Stuart on the front steps. He started to offer a cigarette to Stuart, but when he noticed how small he was, he changed his mind. "Have you any sarsaparilla in your store?" asked Stuart. "I've got a ruinous thirst." "Certainly," said the storekeeper. "Gallons of it. Sarsaparilla, root beer, birch beer, ginger ale, moxie, lemon soda, Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, Dipsy-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, Popsy-Cola, and raspberry cream tonic. Anything you want." "Let me have a bottle of sarsaparilla, please," said Stuart, "and a paper cup." The storekeeper went back into the store and returned with a drink, and he opened the bottle, poured out some into the cup, and set the cup down on the step below Stuart, who whipped off his cap, lay down on his stomach, and dipped up some of the cool, refreshing drink, using his cap as a dipper. You see him? Drinking his sarsaparilla. "That's very refreshing," remarked Stuart. "There's nothing like a long, cool drink in the heat of the day when you're traveling." "Are you going far?" asked the storekeeper. "Perhaps very far," replied Stuart. "I'm looking for a bird named Morgallo. You haven't sighted her, have you?" Can't say I have," said the storekeeper. "What does she look like?" "Perfectly beautiful," replied Stuart, wiping the sarsaparilla off his lips with the corner of his sleeve. "She's a remarkable bird. Anybody would notice her. She comes from a place where there are thistles." The storekeeper looked at Stuart closely. "How tall are you?" he asked. "You mean in my stocking feet?" said Stuart. "Yes." 2 inches, nothing and a quarter," answered Stuart. "I haven't been measured recently, however. I may have shot up a bit." "You know," said the storekeeper thoughtfully, "there's somebody in this town you really ought to meet." "Who's that?" asked Stuart, yawning. "Harriet Ames," said the storekeeper. "She's just your size. Maybe a trifle shorter, if anything." "What's she like?" asked Stuart. "Fair, fat, 40? "No, Harriet is young, and she is quite pretty. She is considered one of the best dressed girls in town, too. All her clothes are tailored especially for her." "That's so," remarked Stuart. "Yes, Harriet's quite a girl. Her people, the Ameses, are rather prominent in this town. One of her ancestors used to be the ferryman here in the Revolutionary days. He would carry anybody across the stream. He didn't care whether they were British soldiers or American soldiers as long as they paid their fare. I guess he did pretty well. Anyway, the Ameses have always had plenty of money. They live in a big house with a lot of servants, and I know Harriet would be very much interested to meet you." "That's very kind of you," replied Stuart, "but I'm not much of a society man these days. Too much on the move. I never stay long anywhere. I blow into a town and blow right out again. Here today, gone tomorrow. A will-o'-the-wisp. The highways and byways are where you'll find me, always looking for Margallo. Sometimes I feel like I'm quite near to her and that she's just around the turn of the road. Other times I feel that I'll never find her and never hear her voice again. Which reminds me, it's time I'm on my way." Stuart paid for his drink and said goodbye to the storekeeper and drove off. But Ames's Crossing seemed like the finest town he had ever known, and before he reached the end of the main street he swerved sharp left, turned off into a dirt road, and drove down into a quiet spot on the bank of the river. That afternoon he swam and lay on his back on the mossy bank, his hands crossed under his head, his thoughts returning to the conversation he had had with the storekeeper. "Harriet Ames," he murmured. Here's him laying on the bank, soaking it all in. Evening came, and Stuart still lingered by the stream. He ate a light supper of a cheese sandwich and a drink of water, and slept that night in the warm grass with the sound of the stream in his ears. In the morning the sun rose warm and bright, and Stuart slipped into the river again for an early dip. After breakfast he left his car hidden under a skunk cabbage leaf and walked up to the post office while he was filling his fountain pen from the public inkwell. He happened to glance toward the door, and what he saw startled him so that he almost lost his balance and fell into the ink. A girl, about 2 inches high, had entered and was crossing the floor toward the mailboxes. She wore sports clothes and walked with her head held high, and her hair was a stamen from a flower. You see him?